What is going on, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome to episode 40 of Trivia, Wisdom, and Refunds. Wait, that's the title. Oh, this is the big boys table. Yeah, that's it. What's up, dude?
Yeah. Did you guys know that Blizzard just released a hip new product called Warcraft III Refunded?
Hell yeah. And on top of that, we get to get it for free, even though we didn't buy it. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, you too get to pay extra for your bandwidth because they just start shoving it down your throat along with all the innumerable bugs that it's associated with.
Yep. So that's Blizzard for you. We won't go too in depth, I don't think, on it, but we can riff on it for a little while. It is, of course,
nobody's really surprised it's a piece of shit, right? Like, this is the company that's only been releasing Dribble for the past 20 years.
Well, listen.
There's still the odd person that blames ass invasion, like they're living in some kind of fever dream.
I think what happened here is Blizzard outsourced to that developer, that DeviantArt profile, and they didn't hear back from that particular, again, DeviantArt profile. I don't actually know if it's a real studio. I know they called like Sunfire Studios or something. I don't remember anything about them. But this is the same people who did...
Oracle calls himself a studio.
Don't say that. Yeah, well... So yeah, they reached out to them. They're like, hey, you guys did a job with Remastered. So we can't say great job.
A job.
We can't say anything. For PR purposes, you did a job. So why don't you do a job for Warcraft 3 Refunded? And we'll see what happens. And then they didn't hear back from them for a long time. And, coincidentally, at the same time as the delay was announced for Reforged, maybe a little bit before. They gotta
make sure it's up to Blizzard quality, guys.
Listen, it might have been a little bit before that this was announced, but at some point in that realm of time, like within a month of the delay being announced, either before or after, the same development studio or graphics studio was tagged as being the people that EA had approached for the Command & Conquer remaster. And so what I think happened is that they just said, fuck this, we're not doing Warcraft 3. We're going to go work on Command & Conquer instead. Which, you're pissing from one asshole to the other at this point, but it seems to me like that's probably something that happened. They took too many jobs. And it shows in the end product, but it already showed as soon as Remastered came out, and it was a disaster. So... How do you feel about...
What is this obsession with remastering anyways?
Well, they can't make new
every
games.
Company that did it didn't make a mess of it. Like, why don't they just make a patch or something?
They can't make a patch. They have to patch the game by moving it to their Blizzard Launcher Battle.net app. And I don't know what else happens because my computer crashed. So... honestly, I actually had to go into the fucking I had to go into the task manager or process explorer to delete the agent.exe or whatever it was called from the Blizzard Battle.net app XD. I had to do that because when I closed it after the whole thing started, the whole download started for Reforged, which happens as soon as you sign in, apparently. After I stopped that and then closed the app using the right click on the taskbar or the whatever it is icon and then quit, it was still open and still slowing down my PC, actually slowing it down more than when it was open. So I had to manually kill the process.
Well, this is what happens when you're running fucking Electron or Chromium or whatever it is for your fucking game launcher.
Yeah. Don't you run an operating system for literally everything these days? Oh, actually, in that vein, I should announce there's a reason why our Discord icons are no longer on the screen. I'm not actually using Discord for this. I'm using Ripcord instead. Audio quality may be a little bit different, but you're not going to see shiny icons. You're just going to have to differentiate between our voices. So good luck. But I figured I would point that out because I'm not subjecting my computer to that anymore. Nor am I subjecting myself to it.
Discord is pretty rancid.
Yeah, so... Just going forward, that's how it'll be.
It's kind of incredible that Discord ever got any kind of steam at all to it. Like, it is got to be one of the worst performing programs I've ever used. The fact that their game detection thing doesn't actually disable when you disable it, and it's a well-known and well-documented problem that it will sometimes interfere with the Windows error reporting service and cause your internet to just shit all over itself, which basically made several games like Hero of the Storm entirely unplayable because Discord was literally like DDoSing my own internet.
It's pretty epic. I mean,
and I mean that's not to speak of the performance and all the other crap.
Maybe we should get somebody who's paid for Discord to let us know if performance improved if they were a paid member.
It hasn't.
Yeah, I'm almost certain it hasn't, but it would be. That would actually be like microtransactions just for your chat client. You know what I mean?
I mean, why would it just can't get over that people's out there actually giving this fucking company money. Like they haven't done any research into the original developer at all, who's already been, someone tried to hold this guy in court for data mining, and he just jumped over to the next heap of shit, which was fucking gullible gamers.
Well, it's actually basically Slack for gamers, right? Like that's how it was.
And Slack is a piece of shit too.
Yeah. So
all this bloated garbage that nobody ever fucking asked for or needed.
Well,
like, come on, like back in AIM in fucking 2001 or something, we had 2 gigabyte fucking file transfers at full speed. Embedded images, no limits, none of this shit. Very, very little downtime. And with Trillion, you had, an 80, 90 megabyte fucking memory imprint? How is it we've gone so far fucking backwards from that? That's AOL! AOL! AOL's the butt of every fucking joke at that point, and they still had a chat service that's infinitely superior than everything that's come out afterwards. And none of these fucking programs have audio quality that even comes within pissing distance of Ventrilo. Like, what the fuck?
Yeah, I mean, it's the same fucking argument that we were having about Reforged now. Well, it's not really an argument,
it's gross.
But you know what I mean? Like, you realize very quickly when you see somebody's screenshot of Process Explorer Task Manager that shows Warcraft III Reforged taking up 10 gigabytes of RAM. Wowee. So that's real.
Yeah, but that's not anything unusual. Fucking StarCraft 2 and Heroes of the Storm use many, many gigabytes of RAM just sitting in the fucking menus. And they still take 30 minutes to load anything in. You still have to load maps in StarCraft 2 to pre-cache shit before you actually play the game. Because even though the game is using multiple fucking gigabytes of memory, it's not actually doing anything. Probably because of all the fucking third-party libraries they have to load first that just consume oceans of memory. I mean, you all own 32 gigabyte systems, right?
Listen, not only are they just taking your fucking free CPU cycles and free RAM and doing nothing with it, but occupying it, just reserving it for the future, I suppose. I actually have to wonder if Warcraft III Reforged is more or less multi-threaded or multi-thread ready than StarCraft 2, because I vaguely recall StarCraft 2 being basically single-threaded. Like, it would get a tiny performance boost, if anything at all, if you multi-threaded it, but only onto one other core. And in some cases, I remember people saying that when they set affinity, I think that's the option, set affinity for like 2 or 3 cores, they actually lost frames. So I don't even know that's fucking possible.
Yeah, Blizzard cannot program asynchronously at all. They use lock a lot, which really, really fucks up a lot of shit. It's why their games are so full of stuttering. To see Blizzard attempt to actually multi-thread something would be quite comedic. But
they can't even multi-thread their AI in Brood Wars, so fuck them, okay? Actually, you might be somewhat interested in commenting on this before we get into the main content of this particular episode. So I don't remember exactly how you structured your AI because I didn't look at it for too long when I was studying up on AI. It was, actually at the time
a lot of different ones.
Yeah, at the time it was too advanced for me, believe it or not. So I was I was learning it in 2017. I was like, what the fuck is all this? This is even more convoluted than hard to read because I was ripping it from the bin file and not I don't know if you hosted it offline anywhere as a text file, but I don't know how much you're familiar with opening up somebody else's AI script.bin file and looking at the AI. But at least the current way that it goes is with the Python unit or tool that I was using, it retitles all of the block names as just random numbers, basically, or a sequence of numbers. So it's like block 0, block 01, block 02.
Yeah, that's what AI edit did. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's like illegible as fuck. You have to like try to keep track of numbers or mass replace them in Notepad or something if you actually want to read something. And it also doesn't help that the Python tool adds a bunch of commas and parentheses that make it more difficult to read. So that's great.
I never could read the fucking, like when the PY stuff came out, I didn't use it primarily because the syntax, there was just so much more to type for the same stuff.
Yeah, I mean, you can translate, maybe you couldn't do it when it first came out. Now you can translate ASC3 or whatever you used to write into the Python ready code, which is what I do because I'm not going to write all that extra shit. But it was, suffice it to say, at the first glance of AI, I had no idea about all this trivia. We'll get into that later. That's a little tidbit, stay tuned. But what I do have to say, though, is there's this basically there's this subset of thought or school of thought with AI editing where you've got some people who think that you should sort of take it in a similar approach to Blizzard, not because Blizzard was good, but because it's more sensible to write it this way, where you basically you multi-thread as little as possible, and you try to keep things very linear, I guess, like a very linear series of instructions, as all AI actually is in the game. And you try to multi-thread as little as possible, whereas I multi-thread stuff as if they were like individual functions within some sort of program. And so like if there's a defense code, any defense code gets into a defense block, and that gets multi-threaded. And we don't have to worry about limits. Before, their concern was like you can only have 100 threads at one time or 1,000 threads at one time or something. That's no longer an issue.
I don't think it was even 100.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
It would crash long before then, in my experience. If you had two AIs that were using like 20, 30 multi-threads, there was a high chance the game was going to just, like, they would either stop working or it would just outright crash.
Oh, well, did you use call at any point?
I cannot say. It's too long ago.
Well, in vanilla, only one call can be active at a time in an entire game, so that might also have caused some crashes. Yeah, so Blizzard really doesn't know how to multi-thread stuff. I mean, it's a little bit better than I'm making it sound. So basically, if you have two calls or if you have two return commands that execute at the same time, it will just crash the game immediately because it returns twice to the same script.
Oh my fucking god!
So I hope you didn't use call as my point.
I might.
At least only once per AI script. Well, once per game at all. Don't ever use multiple. But that's since been fixed. You can have nested calls and all this other fancy modern shit that you never would have expected it to be a limit in the first place. Anyway, point is, multi-threading as if they were functions makes more sense to me and is more readable once you know that that's what you're looking for. Like if something... obviously, you need to sort of add some debug messages or something. If you're trying to debug something, it becomes a little bit more challenging because it's not linear, literally. So you have to, like, if there's a crash or a freeze, you have to wonder, like, all right, is that in the defense block or the town block or the expansion code or whatever? But if there's a problem with a function, you know exactly where to go. And if you need to add something or change something to as part of a function, you can.
How do you know where to go?
Oh, you know the way, obviously. You just control it.
How do you know the way? Because the game doesn't normally tell you this stuff. So back then there was no way other than guessing. So the more multi-threaded something became, the harder
what
it
I
was
mean
to
is
solve.
if your defense code is not working properly and you can observe that effect, you can, or if you think that there's a problem with defending, you can troubleshoot by going into the defense
there were
block.
so many problems with the regular AI. Trying to fucking problem solve that shit was just impossible back then.
Yeah, I guess it's different worlds now, but I was just curious as to your input on it. Assuming you could debug the AI somewhat intelligently, and you didn't have these thread limits. Yeah.
So I tried to avoid multi-threading that much, not just because of the multi-thread limit, that was a serious problem, but also because it made things hard to read. When you start dislocating data from other locations and you have to keep jumping around back and forth, it ends up consuming a lot of time. So what I would multi-thread is stuff that I really didn't need to pay attention to or track a lot. So defense is one of them. The defense use and defense build and stuff like that. That's one thing I would multi-thread. I would also multi-thread stuff like telling them to expand on a loop or their attack management or stuff like that. But the primary build order and everything like that was all done in a single line, generally speaking, except for there were certain instances. It was something I had to test very thoroughly. Like this is where, like I mentioned before, way back, probably not on this podcast, but I have definitely spent like upwards of like hundreds of thousands of hours with this game's AI, and a large amount of that comes into testing individual like line changes in the AI. Especially when I was working on Zapok and stuff like that, this was definitely the part where I was like really concluding that the SE AI editor was just fucked, because there had to have been like something wrong. I mean, there was a lot wrong, obviously a lot more than what I knew at the time, but there was definitely something wrong with the way that stuff was being compiled, because sometimes changing lines would have such far-reaching dramatic effects that they really shouldn't have. And I was using like replays for testing this stuff, so the testing environment and everything else was always identical, always the same. So whenever I would change one little thing, like the placement of one build command, and the whole fucking script would either come to a screeching halt or crashing halt, or just crash the game or something even. Like I said, there was lots of instances where I was actually crashing the game doing this stuff just from changing individual lines.
Yeah, SCAI did corrupted scripts very frequently, so that was probably the case.
Like basically I had found that some, I don't remember specifics, this is over 10 years ago now, but some buildings worked better as a multi-thread. I think ones like the Lair, maybe, or the Greater Spire, those seem to stand out, but I'm maybe getting mixed up with StarCraft 2 because those gave me a lot of problems with StarCraft 2 as well. And,
imagine it being the same across 10 fucking years or whatever.
Morphing stuff in StarCraft 2 really doesn't behave. Banelings don't work. The Greater Spire and stuff like that really didn't want to work. I made the Lurker Den its own building because morphing off the Hydra Den was so unreliable. The games are pieces of shit. And yeah, like with the multi-threading thing, like I found it really annoying to jump back and forth a lot. Like when the script would reach like anywhere like 1,000+ lines, it was at that point like titanically over-engineered. And every single time you started adding more multi-threads, it was more sort of spaces you need to keep track of in the script to bounce back and forth from if you were actually ever changing them. So a lot of the ones I worked with were linear, but I did work with some that were basically the entire fucking thing was multi-threads. I think there had been about 200, 300 or something individual blocks in there that I had to dismantle, like I reverse engineered Shara's Protoss AI to create my carrier spamming AI that was rather effective in the AI versus AI stuff. And that was one that was basically my first major introduction to the kind of method you're talking about on multi-threading everything a lot. But even though I worked with that and reverse engineered and understood how it worked, I still don't like doing that. You kind of sort of had to do it with StarCraft 2, but I reduced as much multi-threading out of StarCraft 2 as I possibly could. I put as much as I could within the build script and pulled out all of the useless shit like counter building and crap like that. That didn't even work properly in StarCraft 2 to begin with, but it was just like extra bloat. Like you had stuff stashed away in different fucking files telling the AI what to build when. And it was really just pointless to have all this stuff so segregated. It was much better just to have it all in one neat little tidy place. And anything that ends up pulling it out of that place ends up creating sort of divergences in what you're looking at. You know, when you're making large sweeping changes, you don't want to have to keep bouncing around back and forth. Now, maybe it's easier to work with stuff today than it was back then. But back then, it was basically like I dreaded going through stuff that was multi-script heavy because in my head, I kind of like consciously map out where things are in relation to like the scroll bar. And when I'm going through it, I keep track of something where it is so I know where I can like instinctively jump to it. And I still do that today a lot with like my mapping and stuff like that. So I know, just subconsciously how many clicks it takes to get here, how much scrolling I have to do to get there. I'm really, really big on being as fast as possible and going through this stuff because it's just not fun. And I want to be as fast and efficient as possible so I can get, back to work and I have, a time limit to a lot of the stuff, basically how much I can focus on it. So I keep track of where my important information is. I keep going back and forth, but every single time you got to have another step in the chain to figure out what to do. If everything is segregated all over the place, now you have to keep track of all this other different shit, or you need some other way to manage it, which is really just not good. Like, say, for example, in StarCraft 2. So in StarCraft 2, one of the galaxy files that controls where buildings are placed in relations to existing buildings and not the buildings that have yet to be built, because I'm pretty sure that whole system is bugged and very, very much untested, because fucking changing supply depots would not get them to stop building them out of the fucking mineral line. But that's located in its own file, and that file is only like a couple dozen lines, tops, minus all the comments and other just wasted space. And that's completely independent from the build list. But this is something that's related to you building structures. To me, it doesn't make sense to split them up that way. I think from certain what the fuck is a word? Programmer perspective, then you do want to divide a lot of this stuff into functions, because it makes sense for something to be more multi-purposable, especially when you're talking about different races whose files are all split up. But for me, I'd much rather just have an easier like single function that I pass it everything I want right away, instead of splitting what other things mean all over the place. Like, there's definitely a limit to where granulation turns into something that ends up making more time for you, or more work for you later down the line. Holy fuck, today's English is so bad.
Well,
but
in
you
the
get what I mean. Like,
yeah.
there's I'd use it, but there's like definitely a very like low bar for when, for at least for me, it gets to the point that I just don't want to do it, and I intentionally avoid it because I know it's going to cause problems for me in the future.
Well, in the Cauldron, you can check out Mike. I sent him to you. I've sent Mesk
I
some
do
AI.
not have software that can open this.
Oh, it's a text file.
Oh, okay. It's AC3. Can you? I figured those would have been a fucking proprietary format with the way Gold Dragon did his shit.
No, I just made the extension that it's there's like a syntax highlighter I have in Notepad++, so that it's all colorful and rainbow. But for you, it'll just be black.
I haven't looked at this in forever. You have drumroll 1,000 lines, not too bad. Yeah, so you have multi-threaded all of your individual attacks.
Where do you see
at least
that?
to a point. TKA, TKB.
Oh, that's just for coordinates. That's for targeting. It has nothing to do with the attack force. If you want to see the attack force script, it's actually very simple. It's like 3 things if you scroll further up.
So obviously a lot of this stuff I've never dealt with because it's way past my time. But I would try to avoid targeting specific locations for this actually very same reason, in that it makes the script too big and too annoying to read. Like, obviously you have commented it in this case, but I would try to find a way of dynamically picking locations smarter than hard forcing in locations. Like, say, for example, in StarCraft 2. In StarCraft 2, I could hypothetically trigger all the attack waves and have them target specific locations or regions on the map. And that's great for when you want to do stuff like targeted drops at very specific time intervals. But it's also something that ends up becoming too static in many ways as well. And
oh yeah, well in the future, I just like as the game state increases in terms of like the presumed number of bases that each player has, they just stop using that entirely and they go to the default algorithm.
Yeah, obviously this is something that you would do if you only if you can do it. But I would pursue like a way to make that default algorithm better and then rely on that so that there's less going on in the AI script. There's less like stuff that's like hard coded into it. Obviously, this is something that I built my AI for StarCraft 2 in a way in which I can take advantage of this stuff if I really want to do. So, I can't say that I wouldn't ever use it. It's just, something that like stands out to me right away when I look at this is, this is all multi-threaded. And in many ways, like I don't know, I don't really think there's probably a better way to do that. You're probably doing some other conditional checks I'm not immediately saying, but
oh yeah, well bring jump is like checking a location for a certain number of things.
Smash burger.
Yeah, bear blower's up there too.
Yeah, bear blower. I thought I read that as Banjo Kazooie Kike.
That's Bazooka Bike.
But as Bazooka Bike. Like, I had to read it like 4 times because like 2 different sets of words were in my head. Doghouse.
Yeah, that builds the bar.
But yeah, this is not as multi-threaded heavy as Ashara's stuff. He had multi-threaded every individual build command. So that
yeah,
was
I don't really know about that. The
really
closest thing that
unnecessary.
you'll see here for that is like telling the AI to explicitly place their town halls in very specific locations depending on which res area they're in.
Because they're dumb fucks.
Yeah, eventually we'll have an algorithm that will reduce the need for that, but until we basically we're going to patch out the existing build algorithm and replace it with something better. But until we have that, this is what
Otherwise,
I gotta
this
do.
is pretty basic stuff. This is like I said, the only thing that really stands out for me is that attack stuff. The rest of this is actually very similar to the last stuff I was making.
Oh, okay. I thought got the impression you were doing something a little bit different. Obviously,
Well,
you're
I
seeing a lot of like
changed it a lot.
yeah, you're seeing a ton of fucking commands that didn't exist back then, like the res area jump and local jump and bear blower. So
Yeah, and a lot of the commands I was using probably didn't work properly, anyways. But yeah, no, this is fairly similar. They're obviously, because you're using newer commands, you'll have a different structure to it. I did a lot of different AI, especially in the evolution of Zapok, is when I really like tried all kinds of different ways of constructing it, because I had a lot of problems with the AI would like soft lock itself partway through the game, and then they would sit there and do nothing until you attacked it. So that was like one of the biggest things I was trying to fix, and it was really just hard coded stuff. There's nothing I could do about it. Just compatibility issues, commands that don't work, bugs like that. They're of the bugs you have told me of thus far, like all of those are probably applicable to those tests. So. But I tried to fix it because I didn't have that information back then. There was nobody else doing research back then. The closest you got was the Brood Warrior API stuff, which was worthless. So, it was just basically flailing around with the tools I had. And only after the fact did I really like start talking to a lot of people who did reverse engineering, and they start telling me about all this stuff that's like really is today. It's like, yeah, of course it doesn't work. The whole fucking thing is probably busted. Like nothing I could have done about it would have made a damn of a difference. But back then I didn't know that. So there was like a lot of attempts to change how the AI was structured to try to fix stuff, and that's where all the endless hours of unit testing every single individual change came from. And in my experience, when you get into that kind of stuff, the more multi-threaded something gets, the harder it can be to problem solve that. In large part, though, because of the unpredictability. So, because you just really don't know what the fuck StarCraft's doing half the time. It's just a wild fucking guess. At least in your case, you can log stuff now. You can have it print logs probably for every ASM command it goes through. It can print a log and print the results, and if the results are different than what you expect, something's wrong. You couldn't do anything like that back then. Like, you'd have no idea why the AI is just sitting there scratching its nuts.
Yeah, well, most of that is generally because you have a situation where the AI receives a command it can't satisfy, and in vanilla it just does nothing until it can satisfy that, which is usually never. And so, like, for example, I think actually this is the case with, if you remember Desperate Alliance, the shitty Zerg 30-minute defense map where you're playing against Zerg? It's like the first real mission is Terran in the vanilla campaign. I don't know if you remember this.
I don't remember any of those maps. The only one I really remember has to be the Tassadar one, where they've got infested Terran gotchas all over the place and this giant installation. That one really stood out to me because it was like, even when I was young and I played that map, I thought, holy fuck, this is stupid.
Yeah. Well, in Desperate
Alliance... Why would
Alliance,
you put this in an RTS?
Oh, well, it's not an RTS map, dude. It's Warcraft II in space. But they managed to make a really dumb move in the AI script for the Zerg enemy in the third Terran mission, because 3. And in that particular AI, they have a request for a spire, but they don't have a request for a lair. So if you kill the spire, the AI will never attack again. So there you go. And that's just in the very first fucking script of the entire game. So that's pretty cool.
I remember looking through all their AI scripts many times and being absolutely bewildered at how fucking wasteful they are. How, like, the simplest scripts just use thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of lines absolutely pointlessly, and they don't even do their basic jobs correctly. The melee AI for that game is so horrible.
I like the one where I was like doing a demo of something 2 days ago or something like that, because somebody in my chat was asking me to give them tips on how to improve as an RTS player. So I was like going through, I was like, yeah, you're just building workers all the time. And my opponent in the fucking map was just like a default Protoss AI. I was expecting the 12 Zealot Rush. Instead, what I got was the build photon cannons forever build. and then they built a gateway at like 6 minutes or something retarded. So it's pretty good.
Yeah, and they might just sit there. They might just soft lock and never actually progress past the initial expansion and cannons.
Yeah, I think if their
And they'll
cybernetics
just
core gets
jack around.
built too late or something because they don't have enough money. That's what I was observing in some Big Game Hunters games a while ago. Is if they don't have enough money to get their cybernetics core at a certain point, they
You know what I
the
like
request
about Big
should
Game
be there.
Hunters?
So I don't know. I don't get it. Yeah, what?
This exposition breaks any Zerg that ever spawns there.
That's okay because that center base, I'm sure you've observed AIs building to the bottom
Yeah.
right. That's because the resource area is
fucking
actually
makes
set
sense.
there. Yeah, that's a
Yeah.
resource area. Like that's a bug with the map and or the algorithm that creates resource areas. So that's just lizard. But yeah, anyway, I figured that was a worthy enough detour because it's actually kind of limited anyway, or kind of linked rather anyway to the main topic. So I talked a little bit about this before we started in the cauldron, but chatted about the idea of going oscillating between the discussion points of what trivia is and what wisdom actually is in terms of what you can express as a developer. And I feel like this is just a truism in general for all of life, but particularly when you have to learn a bunch of stupid workarounds like we have to for Brood War AI, and like you were trying to figure out for back when you were still investigating it, and like you had to do for StarCraft 2. And actually, one of the reasons why I was reminded of this anyway is because I remember you talking about how in Unreal you have like actual debug tools and a bunch of other crazy shit that's like maybe not industry standard, but a lot fucking closer than StarCraft 2. So, no, I'm here. You. No, you died. Rip. Well, I don't know exactly where I was when I cut out for you, but I was
You're
basically
talking about something breaking, I think.
Oh yeah, I was just I was saying that I was reminded of this whole topic because of the fact that I remember you saying that whenever something broke in Unreal, you actually had debug tools that maybe they weren't
Yeah.
industry standard, but they were a lot closer to what that would actually mean in a sane world than StarCraft 2 by comparison. And
Honestly, they're above industry standard at this stage. Like
Oh, okay.
companies like Blizzard would never have anything like this. So
Yeah. And I think it's interesting and I would say important for people to differentiate between when something is trivia and nothing else, and when something is actually useful information or has something to do, some sort of like just by virtue of experiencing it, you can make a statement, an informed position on whether or not the developer in this particular example had any wisdom to impart. And it's sort of like the difference between knowing how tiles are placed in a map and actually designing a level that is interactive. You know what I mean? It's like there's a difference between the minutia of a technique and what you need that can't really be communicated. Like nobody's going to know that you had to manually place all of these doodads or manually place all of these tiles for whatever reason because you couldn't figure out isometry in Brood War, which is our current situation. Nobody's going to know that when they just play the map. They're just going to see the environment. And so if you can construct a believable and immersive environment, and you can also go through and construct a level that is actually interactive and engaging from an RTS standpoint, that's a lot more indicative of your skill as a developer than like just knowing the minutia of how to place tiles in the first place. And so that's where we get into this whole trivia versus wisdom thing, where you have the idea that, hey, we should be looking for ways to maximize how we can express our wisdom from just looking at our tools, minimize the amount of trivia we need to learn to make our shit work. And it's like knowing which flags to tick in units.dat or something to make a unit not crash the game. It's sort of the same thing. That's trivia, and then wisdom is knowing how to make a unit that's actually fun to play with and engaging to play against and involves skill expression and contributes positively to the overall game state. So I don't know if you have any real initial thoughts on this topic as we start to get into it.
it makes me think of the problems I had in Unreal where I was trying to put stuff in from other shit, and I ran into problems where 3ds Max wouldn't handle the fucking smoothing and some of the animations and shit like that. And I was forced to use Blender, and I was stuck in an interface that is as bad as StarCraft 2's.
Oh yeah, I think this was
With the,
coming up in
community
conversation.
that's just as bad as StarCraft 2's.
Oh,
if
really?
not worse. Like just complete incompetence everywhere. And really making it even worse is just the fact that they just had to change their interface all over the fucking place every patch. because that rather than like try to improve the interface, they'd rather just throw everything out. So now you have a lot of resources that would have been great, but they're for different versions of the program and all this other shit. And obviously working with Unreal 4 is great compared to StarCraft 2 and stuff like that. I mean, it has problems, but we were making some nice progress. And then to get the 3D stuff in, I had to work with fucking Blender, which means dealing with this fucking garbage from people who eat shit off of their feet. Like, if I was to describe Blender concisely, I would describe it as a science fair project by a really, really, really pretentious Stallman fan. It is such a wild fucking program in that it basically expects you to know hundreds of hotkeys to really make use of basic functions. And whoever designed the interface really never intended for people to actually learn it or really get into it. Now, some people can learn it and get into it and, make interesting things with it. It's got some better tools in it than 3ds Max. However, the basic features of the program, the basic functionality and the learning curve for actually getting into it are like the most wild, inconsistent, and steepest shit I have ever seen out of probably anything I've used, except for maybe Soft Image XXI, where clicking in the viewport would crash it. So that was worse for that reason, but the interface on it was still a lot better. Like Blender, for one, Blender has to use a different control scheme than everybody else, and everybody else has to use a different control scheme than each other. And I think Unreal 4 uses a control scheme like Maya, but everybody else has to be different. So everything is modeled off of that different. And I mean, you can change a lot of hotkeys and stuff like that, but if you don't know what hotkeys to change, like if you don't understand the program, then changing all the hotkeys is going to make things harder for you, because now you have to go off of any references you're looking at to, they're based on the old hotkey system, and now you have to go through an extra step to adapt into your hotkey system when you don't really understand what you've changed. And there's a lot of little things in there that really just are bizarre. Like every single time you import an FBX file, you're going to duplicate every single bone in the entire scene. And that is not something that happens in Unreal 4. That's not something that happens in 3ds Max. It's not something that happens in StarCraft 2. That's not something that happens in any other program I've ever used. It's a Blender thing, because Blender doesn't support the kind of bones or something like that these use. So it has something called leaves. Now, leaves can be useful and interesting when you're making a rig, but when you're importing something, you're actually doubling the bone count in the scene absolutely pointlessly, and now those are all going to get imported into Unreal 4 pointlessly, and deleting them all by manual is an absolute pain in the ass, because you can't just search the scene for something with a name, because it's not easy like that. So now you have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of extra bones cluttering the scene, and the first thing you think of is, how the fuck do I clean this up? And then you spend days to potentially weeks trying to figure out how, only to either mysteriously come across something unrelated, which is, I think, what happened for me, is I found that there was an FBX option for leaves, and you turn that off, you stop getting them, but your scene is still infested with these fuckers, and you have to go through a bunch of other menus to select something.
Was that from the pizza
I forget
thing?
the even process, but it just wasn't easy. It just wasn't easy. Like, it's the basic thing, search the scene for everything by name, really was not possible within Blender. I mean, it probably is possible somewhere, but when you go into the collections view with the thing there, and you have to type in a name and then a wildcard like you do in, say, Windows or any other fucking piece of software that makes sense to do so in, nothing happens. So, Blender is just not built by common sense. It wasn't used by anybody who has common sense. And, to go from Unreal 4, which I had been working with, to this, that was a really big demoralizing blow to the project, because now I had to basically jump through flaming hoops to even come within pissing distance of any of the basics I could do in 3ds Max. Not because I knew anything about 3ds Max, but because 3ds Max's stuff was labeled in a user understandable way, in a human readable way. And Blender just decided, rather than copying conventions that people have been using for years and years and years, it's just going to come up with all of its own conventions. So trying to do things like changing the background color for the viewport and other stuff like that, or trying to get the textures and stuff to be higher resolution and not blurry as fuck, or just simple basic shit like figuring out where to save and open up files. All this stuff is done in really, really bizarre pants on head retarded ways that really just don't logically make sense. So it's this massive hurdle for you to overcome just to understand what you're doing. Like, I understand I'm Canadian and Canadians aren't exactly smart, but I really shouldn't need to have to Google up every single fucking thing I want to do when I'm just trying to open a file, move around some vertexes, change some stuff so I can see what the fuck I'm doing, and then save it again. This process really shouldn't take me several hours to figure out, but it did. Whereas in 3ds Max, I've never once had to look up anything related to 3ds Max except for anything related to Gildor's tools, and that's something third party. It doesn't even apply. And yes, I've had a lot of time to learn 3ds Max, but I never learned 3ds Max. I don't know what the fuck I'm doing, but I can import stuff. I can play around with the animations without even having a rig. I can change the materials. I can make particle effects. I can do fume effects. You know, I made those CGI scenes for Armageddon Onslaught way back. I rendered all this crap that people are still using today. I did all this stuff without ever actually needing to look up anything because, you know, well, 3ds Max doesn't have a great interface. It makes sense. You know, the user level makes sense. And then when you want to get into more complicated stuff, you know, then when you wanted to get into advanced systems, then you're going to run into problems. You know, in Blender's credit, the UV wrapping interface is way better than Max. Not because Blender is any good, but because Max hasn't touched their UV wrapping interface in like 20, 25 years. And they're not going to because there is no competition for Autodesk. Nobody makes competition. And Blender is not competition. Blender is just, it is so fucking awful. Just so bad. And I cannot think of an example where I'd say, hey, this is great, because there are none. The production software everywhere is fucking terrible, which is where our problem comes in. To do stuff that should be really basic is not. So the second I step out of Unreal 4, I enter TISM territory again. And it makes me hate that. I loathe that process so much because there's so many extra things I need to figure out that are not actually related to me making content. There's this massive overhead. I spent about 3 months with Blender. 3. And like from the time that I started to get into it to do my ports, and then the time the project got put on hold because of real life. And in those 3 months, I learned absolutely nothing. And I watched just dozens of hours of videos and read tons of shit. And it just didn't teach me fucking anything because I can't memorize hundreds of hotkeys and all these other things that are named differently just for the sake of being different, just to do really, really basic shit. I was constantly having to re-look up videos just to figure out hotkeys to select detach stuff. And I had to go through a million different right-click menus. Anytime I'd go to the right side of the screen looking for basic operations, it's not there. Menus just are not designed like that. Now, Unreal 4, obviously Unreal 4 is a way more complicated piece of software, and there's still a lot of stuff in it that's not really that great. And I still had to ask, HKS and read up a lot on it. But the learning curve on that is way easier, and once you, this is the really weird thing about Unreal 4 that I actually had a lot of problems with, is I forget there's debugging tools. I forget they're there. I forget it has the power to show you all this stuff. Because I have worked with crap like StarCraft II and Supreme Commander and stuff like that forever, where their idea of debugging tools is basically just vomit on your lap, at best. They just don't really give you anything. Supreme Commander, because it was Lua, it would piss out some Lua errors, but because Lua is so brilliantly designed of a scripting language, it will usually just keep happily running while it's throwing you errors, which is basically the last thing you want to happen. And yeah, it was hard to pinpoint a lot of stuff because the errors would be nested and stuff. You would have errors nested behind 4 or 5 or 6 layers of shit that was referencing each other. It was hard to hunt stuff down. Now, Unreal 4, let me just take a quick little peek here. I'm sure I've got some screenshots that I was puking at, but this is really surface level stuff. But I mean, Unreal 4. You can, let's say, for example, I'm struggling with performance in a scene. Now, since Warcraft 3 was brought up, there's a lot of really, really like inept people and uneducated people throughout Warcraft 3's lifespan that have cried about poly counts, as though poly counts are a performance impact in any game past like 2001. And that's like a complaint you would see a lot with Warcraft 3 stuff in general. Something like is higher than 10 poly, so it's too high poly.
Yeah.
And therefore it will cripple modern computers or something. I mean, Warcraft 3 will cripple modern computers, but that's because it's high poly. But there's one of the reasons why this became a meme is because there really wasn't a lot of end user stuff to measure performance. So people just don't understand where performance impacts can actually come from. They just think, oh, it's higher detail, quote unquote, so that must mean it's more expensive, which in many cases, that makes sense. That makes sense. Higher detail and more expensive to render. But now you have to ask, what does detail mean? What is detail? Detail could be polygons. It could be texture resolution. It can be bone count. That's a big one. It can be animation data. That's usually what comprises the bulk of file size for games like Warcraft 3. And then you start asking about sorting and transparency and overdraw and all this other shit. And let me take a look at these images. Okay, so I don't know a lot about this stuff. I can't educate you firmly on what a lot of this stuff actually is, but I am going to send you a couple images here. Okay. So that first image was when I was trying to hunt down a bug. And I had a bug where Unreal 4 would eventually run out of memory and then crash. And what we eventually narrowed this down to is that the game was just leaking memory within the render target, which is just the screen. I mean, just think of it as a screen, basically. And it was because my project was old and I needed to update Unreal, and my project file was really old, and there was some kind of like incompatibility. Like, it was one of those really obscure things. Memory leaks can be really hard to hunt down, so this is something we never actually figured out the specifics of. But in the first image, what I could tell by just looking at this one set of information here is, I can tell what is using what memory and what percentage of our budget that is using. So say if I was developing for a console or a phone, I can configure our budgets, and it'll tell me when we are reaching those budgets. Or I can just specifically look at this, and it'll tell me what exactly is using what memory. Now, there's many different kinds of graphs. Now, that second image I sent you, that is actually for AI. So the green is the pathing mesh. You can change its sensitivity to stuff and how big it is. The little arrows are actually custom-placed objects that the AI reads to connect different islands of pathability together so they can jump between ledges. And yes, those are Z sensitive. They will go under the bridge and they will jump over it. This was actually something I did within my very first week with Unreal 4, outside of making maps, was Z navigating AI. So that was easy.
But I played God of War and other industry-leading software, and they don't have anything like that. I think you might be hacking.
Yeah. That is definitely what people would think, is that it is some kind of advanced thing, but this is actually not advanced at all. It's still using, I don't know what the pathing system called, A star or something like that. That is the cornerstone for the pathing behind this. So it's not like some kind of new hyper advanced thing. It's more than likely something that you had access to within engines like those God of War used. People didn't do it because they're lazy, 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 lazy. Now, something else I'm going to show you here is okay. So the third image. Okay. So Unreal uses something called Blueprint for a lot of its stuff. You can still do things in C++ if you want to. Yes, I'd love to get into C++. I'd love to become a programmer. Yes, C++ is faster. However, the speed differences are not really a big difference in a lot of stuff that we're working with at this time, especially since this actually compiles into C++. It's just a matter of really taking advantage of better optimizations when you use C++ natively. But until then, you're using Blueprint, visual scripting. And visual scripting can be a really ugly thing to work with, especially when you're looking at complicated stuff, because as you can tell, screen space becomes something of a doozy. Now, you can inline stuff, you can have embedded functions, you can stuff stuff into other graphs. Please don't do that. It makes things hard to read.
You can multi-thread.
There is a very, very, yes, you are multi-threading. I do not know how this translates into the game code for multi-threading, but I can tell you it's really hard to make it perform badly. So if it's performing badly from Blueprint, you've probably done something wrong, actually. So what we're looking at right here is actually something that governs this character's let me take a quick. So upper bottom. Okay, so this is actually controlling his animations. So in the top portion, we have something called locomotion, and then the Greystone AL blend space, and then the pose. So what this is doing, the anim offset. So I'm not actually sure what they're doing at that point. This wasn't something I set up. This was something from their shit. I'm not actually sure what the blend space is doing. I think that the locomotion is basically assigning it to a certain set of bones in the body. So locomotion is going to be its own, think of it as like your own AI script block. And if I open that up, it'll have a whole bunch of different stuff, and it says, am I walking? Play the walking animation. Am I jumping? Play the jumping animation, etc., etc., etc. Now we go into the second chunk, which is the upper body layer. So when you have games like, say, for example, World of Warcraft or Warframe or something like that, there is actually a screenshot floating around on the internet of Warframe's animation behavior tree kind of thing like this. And it's grotesquely enormous because of all the cases for all the weapons they have. And it can become a pain in the ass to sort out. So that's why we have stuff like these caches and these slots and stuff like that. We are dividing the lower body from the upper body so that we can manipulate the upper body through things like our aiming offset. So in Counter-Strike, for example, if my opponent is aiming his rifle upwards, we will actually see his upper body tilting upwards and the gun in the head or something like that angling a little more. You do that. This is what this is doing. And then the IK in the very bottom is basically blending whatever we've done to set up the IK. There's many different ways to set up IK. We don't even necessarily need to do anything very complicated at all. And we set that up in there. In the future, I may tell you guys how ALS works, because that might be something interesting to talk about when I understand more about it when I get back into it, because that's actually the most complicated locomotion system that I have ever seen. Is basically replicating what would be, I guess, considered the top industry standard for how movement animations work and behave. And I can explain how that works in Unreal 4, because there's actually a lot of people who don't understand how that works. It is an asset on the Unreal Marketplace, but it was available for free for a while because they do release some stuff for free. And a lot of people, like, it's one of those really controversial things where a lot of people consider it one of the most valuable assets because of what it does. It basically implements like your her definition cinematic looking movement controller for your models. But it's also like, it is super insanely like in AI script terms, multi-thread heavy, where everything is embedded into thousands of different functions. It's really, really, really hard to get into. It's really, really, really confusing, and a lot of people dropped it because they don't understand how it works. So in the future, I might talk about something like that. But that's another case where, like, the way that this guy set it up, he really had no. It was like he had no intentions of ever letting anybody else see it. It just wasn't made for any kind of future proofing whatsoever. It is such a massive, massive beast to get into. Now, while we're looking at this image, we can tell that, you know, a lot of this stuff for most people, they're probably not going to really understand what's going on. But once you understand the concept of animating different parts of the body at once, then at least the idea of what's happening here makes sense. You know, then we can understand those red things are actually Booleans. And what's happening in the middle is that we are switching between certain pose states depending on if we are in full body state or if we're accelerating or not, or stuff like that. And all the cached poses is just our different animations that we've referenced elsewhere. And then we output to the full body, and the full body takes the IK, which handles where the feet are placed in relation to the ground. So once we understand just those basic concepts, then we basically can look at this and it sort of explains itself. That's really what you want. That's really, really, really what you want out of a tool set, out of a game, out of a mod, out of the internal workings is self-commenting either content or code or whatever you want to call it, self-documenting material. You want something that makes sense for a person looking at it. Not everything is going to make sense for everybody, because if you don't understand the first fucking thing about animation, half the shit I just said probably doesn't make any sense anyways. But if you understand the very basics, like if you walked into Counter-Strike or walked into World of Warcraft and you know that the upper body turns different than the lower body, you know some things controlling that, that's where this is. Understanding the concept, this self-documents how that concept works. You don't need to understand the inner mechanics. So that's something that makes sense. Like, that's something that makes sense. StarCraft 2's data editor having a unit description and a unit name on opposing sides of the list, that doesn't make sense. That's something that has no fucking logic behind it whatsoever. Because now you have two related pieces of information that are in totally unrelated locations. That's what Blender's like. Blender is just shit all over the fucking place. If you can figure out how to use it, that's great. I'm sure you can make, high quality stuff with Blender. I've seen high quality stuff with Blender. People work with Blender. People do good stuff with Blender. Blender is capable of a fast workspace. But getting to that point is really, really difficult. It's just like with StarCraft 2. If you do know the data editor in StarCraft 2, you can make some pretty neat stuff with it. But there's a reason why nobody does that. Because the learning curve is too high and it's too annoying to work with. You got two different things going on when you're working with software, when you're working with games, when you're working with content within this. Is first of all the learning curve, and then second of all the workflow. I don't know what this trivia thing is. Like, when I hear you say trivia and wisdom, to me, like, that doesn't really click. But when I think of things, I think of things in this two-dimensional sense, where I've got, how long does it take to learn something? And then after I've learned it, how difficult is it to actually work with? So let's say, for example, me making transparent images for faces and sprites and stuff in D&D. So the learning curve for that is figuring out the best techniques to alpha out pieces of the image without destroying it. And then after that, it's how can I make this fast and efficient? But I can't make that fast and efficient. There is no way. You have to do it pixel by pixel manually. It's always going to take a long time because you are always going to be doing it pixel by pixel. Therefore, your measurement of time really comes down to your source material, how complicated the image is, how large it is, how destroyed by JPEG compression is, so on and so forth. When you walk into something like this, the more self-evident something is by looking at it, the less time you have to figure out how to work with it. That's one of the most important things about the toolset. It's not just how fast it is or how it lays out your information, but how seamless it is for you to jump in and out of it. Because every developer worth anything is going to be testing stuff nonstop, perfecting stuff nonstop, working with the same stuff, improving it, future-proofing it nonstop, piece by piece by piece, making sure each and every individual piece works. You're going to be working with this stuff for years. You can't walk into something like this and say, I'm going to have a good project done within a month. I got a lot done in a month, but that was because I had experienced people with me. That's because I put a lot of time in it. That's because I understood what I was dealing with. I understood what I was looking at, but it was also because of how this shit was laid out. And I'm going to see if I can find you some more images. But like when it came to Blender, that didn't exist. Those resources didn't exist. Yeah, I had tons of videos from people who understood Blender and understood what they're looking at, but that information that, this makes sense, that didn't exist. That doesn't exist with Blender, because in Blender, it's just like StarCraft 2. You're constantly scratching your head thinking, what the fuck do I do now? how do I do this? How do I do that? Because there's nothing that immediately jumps out and says, that's how this works. This makes sense in this way. About the only point which you can do that is, as far as I've seen, with the UV editor, because UVs are so simple by concept, it's hard to abstract them to the point they don't make sense. And HKS was asking me, oh, yes, this is great right here. See, this enjoy your needlessly large image. HKS was asking me something I had to figure out myself a couple days ago. Is the guy released a tool for Blender to import in stuff to rig to the Unreal 4 mannequin, and he's asking me, so where's this toolbar? Because there's a toolbar that contains the links for this plugin. Once you've installed it, you have to launch it through a toolbar. This guy doesn't fucking tell you where the toolbar is. So I spent hours and hours and hours and hours and hours and hours scouring the fucking internet looking for Blender toolbar. Would I find it? No. Only by chance did I find it. If you look at this image, this is an image I sent to HKS. You look in that little circle, you see that little arrow? That opens the toolbar. Nobody tells you that. That's the toolbar. That's not a toolbar. That's a fucking arrow hidden over there somewhere.
Toolbard.
Like it would be simple to say it's a toolbar that is hidden behind a context arrow in the upper right next to the camera widget. Like, that makes sense. No, at least if you don't immediately recognize it, you know where to look. But this information is just not given to you. Just not given to you. And that's the biggest problem with Blender. The people who design Blender and the people who use Blender is they just assume that everybody has spent the however many years it would take to really get a hold of this interface and be able to weather the changes it goes through. And you might be wondering, like that third image I sent with the blueprints, I'm going to send you another image here. It'll be more obvious what you're looking at. Okay. So in this image, what you're going to see in the top right of the main viewport there is simulating. So what that means is actually the game is running right now. And I can hook this event graph for this code, this thing, this blueprint, this script, to anything that it's related to in the game. I can hook it to any instance, and it will tell me precisely what is going on with that unit. That orange line is telling you what is currently active. So it's telling me that we are currently setting a variable, which is rotation last tick. We are casting to the character and getting information from it, which is our current acceleration. By the way, if I hover my cursor over any of those things, it will tell me the exact value in memory at that point in time for that value, which has been useful because I was trying to hunt down things where stuff wasn't receiving like the right angles or something like that. I think it was for an overlay effect I was spawning. And it would turns out because it's feeding me 0, 0, 0, which means that somewhere, earlier down the line, I'm not collecting that information correctly. So I can do this right here in the graph. I don't have to get an external tool out. I don't have to go through a command line. I don't have to look at any of the other shit. It's literally right here in the editor that's active while the game is active. I can look through all this data from the game while it's running. I can look through the value of the AI character. I can look through what the controller for an AI character is using. I can look through the individual values of each Boolean, of each variable. I can look at the velocity values. I can look at all the world positions. I don't know if I have a screenshot of it, but I can even look exactly what the behavior, here you are. I can look at exactly what the behavior tree for the AI is doing. This is not in the debug mode, but this will be all illuminated and tell you what conditions are set and what aren't set for the AI as it's behaving. You can hook it to any individual unit and see precisely what they're doing as they're running around the game and why they're doing it. And you can figure all your conditions and stuff related to. And you write the functions for this. Some of them are built in. They're just like examples, but you make your own stuff. This was all stuff that I made. I made my own conditions for attacking while moving and stuff like that. And I mean, I just followed tutorials for 90% of this because I was just getting into it. But, it's a far cry from say for example, Brood War or StarCraft, especially StarCraft 2, where you really have no idea what's going on at any point at all, and you can just guess, because it's such an over-engineered piece of shit to begin with, much less actually trying to debug it. With Brood War, like I said, you have people who are working with ASM, so if you really want to print out debug for stuff, you can do that, and you don't necessarily need a huge interface to do all this stuff. You just need, the information that you want. And I can show you. I do have a screenshot of the current value reporting right here. But like this comes out of the box. This is all here, and you just don't get this in normal tools. So it's like I said, this is beyond industry standard at this stage. I know that obviously things like Unity and CryEngine and stuff like that, they will have debugging tools because they are intended to be licensed to people. But I have never heard of anything actually being as well integrated as this, and we are just like scratching the surface of the debugging tools at this stage. Like there's so much I don't know that I can't tell you about, but like to me it would be unthinkable to go back to something like StarCraft 2 after getting as far into this as possible, because like I had problems in this with the AI, and it, like, say for example, not facing me correctly or doing something like that. But there's like a million different ways I can approach just the very idea of the AI pursuing me. Whereas in StarCraft 2, say for example, I wanted to do something like what you're doing, changing where the AI attacks. I basically have two ways to do that. I can let the hard code manage it, or I can make waypoints. And that's effectively what you're doing. And that's kind of like it. But in Unreal 4, I can change what that hard code would be. And just having access to that in a manner in which I can understand, not being a programmer at all, by any stretch of the imagination. I've been exposed to code all my life, for as fuck as I actually understand any of it. The fact that I have already been able to do all this stuff that, these fucking AAA, quote-unquote, developers can't do, and have demonstrated the inability to do it, and I've already done it. Like, it just goes as far as to show that, this is something, even like out of the box at this point, nobody really looks at this stuff. I've still been able to do it. I've still been able to figure it out. And it's just because of the way the tool that offers it to you. It's just the features that the tool has that just allow you to see the kind of information going on. And then even my tiny little Canadian brain can click stuff together and say, okay, so this works because of that. This may not work because of that, and stuff like that. And yeah, I often have to have people help. But like, if I want somebody to help me out, I can give them this information right off the bat. I don't need, a network set up to feed them information that is relevant to what's going on. I can literally show them the debug data that I'm saying, and they don't have to have the project. They don't have to go through things. They don't have to dig through things, with a fucking, Ollie or something like that. Because right out of the bat, we already see all this stuff. And I got a little taste of that when I worked with the UDK, and I knew that if I ever actually really got into this, I would never want to mod again. But I mean, it was really like the games that drove me away from modding, and it was Unreal 4 that just really reinforced, like, this is what really modding should have been like to begin with. Like, a lot of these kind of tools, not with this level of finesse, but still tools generally do exist when you're making a game. A developer is not going to make a game out of fat nothing. They're going to have some kind of tools. Like Blizzard and the art tools, the exporter that supports Legacy of the Void, they still haven't released. To this day, as far as I know.
Nope.
Like, they could give you this stuff, and it can just be under a license that says, hey, we're not responsible. It's not intended for a public audience. But if it works for you, that's great. If it doesn't, we don't support it. It'd be so easy for them to write a clause like that, wash their hands free of it, and say, go fucking hog wild. But they don't.
Well, employees in the company do, but the company itself does not. That's for sure.
Yeah, they would probably get fired if they knew.
No. Well, that was the intimation when I was still on the SC2 Mapster Reptiloid server. So, yeah. Now, you said earlier you didn't quite get the connection between what we're talking about now and the whole idea of trivia versus wisdom and comparing the two. So I wanted to give you another sort of angle at it. And this one may make more sense to the viewers as well because it's more general use. It's not from the perspective of a developer. It's from the perspective of a player. And so you're playing an RTS mission, you walk into the map, and a scripted sequence of events that always happens the exact same way annihilates you. And the only way you could have known is if you scouted in the exact right position at the exact right moment in order to see something. Basically, the RTS version of a QuickTime event. I saw this so many times in Warcraft II and while playing Necron's content. Big surprise. So this is trivia. The solution to this problem is trivia, right? It's not going to make you wiser as a player. It's not going to prepare you for the next challenge in the QTE campaign. It's not going to prepare you for what you need to do. All it really does is let you know that something like this exists, which is pretty much the wisdom that you get from all trivia, is that the fact that it's you need this trivial knowledge in order to fix these trivial problems or work around them. That makes you that much wiser in that sense, but it's very targeted knowledge. It's not something that you can then make cross-compatible. So whatever you learn from figuring out trivia, it's sort of like keyboard shortcuts. It's sort of like hotkeys. It's sort of like figuring out, like, imagine if every single hotkey, if copy, it was, instead of being Control C, was a different hotkey in every single program, then knowing the hotkey for copy would be trivia depending on the program. It wouldn't really make you any wiser to know all these different hotkeys depending on the program, right? So it's a sort of the similar thing with regards to this player example. Knowing that the AI, sends this number of units at you at this time from this position, on this particular map does not help you when you go into the next map, beyond making you expect maybe there's going to be something similar between the different maps. But you don't really have any wisdom that you gain beyond knowing that there could be something that happens in the early game. And so it's super nebulous, and in order to really learn it, you got to learn it inside and out. It's very targeted, and it can't be translated to other things. So the lessons you learn from one mission can't really translate to the next, or at least you have no fucking guarantee that it will translate. And so this is my gripe with that kind of content, just like it's my gripe with these kinds of tools, where the workarounds that you learn are only as good so long as you're working within this environment. They don't improve your ability to actually develop content. They simply facilitate you to use these tools in order to get your content developed. And so the distinction there is, like, me knowing exactly where all of Blender's options are doesn't help me model. Just like me knowing where 3ds Max's options are doesn't help me model. But me knowing how to model, like, these things get in the way of that at best. Is there just a barrier? And at worst, they actively disrupt the experience, which is what you were finding in your experience with this particular program. Mm-hmm. And so that maybe that helps clear up the confusion with the terminology I was using, because I think what it comes down to is, like, in order to express your skill as a developer, you need to, like... So the things that the player actually plays, the end user experiences, those things are, like, any excuses for development washes away. Like, if you were really stressed or you had some shit going on, people aren't going to know that going into the project, and they're not really obliged to care either. And so it's kind of the same thing as if you had shortcomings with your tools. So I'm not arguing that you should give developers a pass because they're working with shitty tools. I'm simply saying that the stuff that is really important about, takeaways from the project, how good the level is, how objectively good the elements of it are, like what the grade of the production value is, and all this other stuff, figuring out how good something is as an end product, these involve analyzing elements that are objective and that are more obvious in the experience, right? So just like I gave the example of terrain earlier, and people are going to see a level, they're going to see some doodads, they're going to see a scene, and they're going to see an environment. And the objective quality of that environment and of that level has pretty much nothing to do with what tools you needed to use in order to make that stuff. Like, that informs how you proceeded into producing it, but it doesn't really inform your ability to communicate whether or not you're a good level designer. It just tells us that you know how to do it, which we don't really care about because we want to just experience your end product. So again, maybe this helps clear up the confusion behind that.
Yeah, that makes more sense.
Yeah. So I guess my big point of it so far is that it's just been something I've been thinking about, because I guess I've already been designing my levels like this, where I want players to have to learn as little trivia that's map specific as possible. And I want them to feel more like they're building expectations and learning lessons that will help inform their future battles against the same characters and against the same races and using their race. And that's how things scale up over the campaign, is that they're expected to funnel all of the lessons that they've learned from playing the first mission and the second mission and the third mission all the way until the final one they're supposed to build on the lessons that they learned and improve the skills that they've been refining this whole time with every single mission in order to continue proceeding and continue progressing in the campaign. And sometimes there'll be some new things, but it's never going to be something that they learn and then they discard and they never need again until presumably the end of the campaign, at which point there's nothing left for them to build into. But ideally, then they could take it into multiplayer or something and be improved in that sense. But at the very least, like as long as the campaign still has a next map, they can take the lessons that they learned previously and apply them to that map. And that's how I've been building my maps. But I'm thinking now that from the same kind of perspective of just taking the developer's perspective, but the same kind of idea and the same principle, that's how I should be building my own tool set when I'm making my own RTS in the future. And that's how I should be building my editors and my, everything that I'm building from a more utilitarian perspective, because that will allow it so that, like, obviously as a developer, I'm going to be able to express my skill developing content better if I don't have to worry about as much trivia and as much user interface, user experience bullshit as you've had to with Blender, and we've all had to with all of the StarCraft modding tools down the years. So I don't know if you gave much thought to this, because like obviously you're working within a pre-existing tool set. You don't, as far as I understand, have any aspirations to make a game that would have its own developer kit. Per se. So, but maybe you could speak to it as somebody who's used several developer kits and several modding tools, and like you sort of already did this, I guess, but where you talked about how comparing what modding was to what it should have been, and how what it should have been was pretty close to what Unreal actually is.
Yeah. I mean, it's not just in terms of debugging, but also just general user flow. Like,
right, exactly.
Say, for example, going from StarCraft 1 to StarCraft 2, the first thing you're struck with is how Blizzard just obviously didn't use their game at all. I mean, they did everything through XML anyways, but like you can see in their office videos, they had a couple in the development of StarCraft 2. The editor they were using looks nothing like the one now, because they basically slapped together a library at the end out of net for all the user interface and just blindly parsed it through there and called it a day. And it shows, because all the information is so horrendously disorganized. And like I said before, the big example I like to use when opening up in this is the unit name and description being on opposing sides of the list, because even Warcraft 3 gets this right. And Warcraft 3 isn't very well organized, but it gets this right. And that's the thing. Like, this is just general basic stuff that goes into your workflow. Like, if you're going to be editing the username or unit name, why wouldn't the description be far behind? Like, they both are very related by context, but that information is not collected in context in StarCraft 2. And a lot of the naming conventions in StarCraft 2 make no sense. Like cooldown being period. Like, once you understand what period means, okay, you can read it that way, but it's not something that catches the eyes. It's not something you think of. It just doesn't make sense logically.
That's trivia for me. That's what I think is like a quintessential example of trivia. Is like somebody calls it a different thing, just like if somebody has a different hockey in a different program than what you're used to, but for the same exact thing. Like, why not keep it industry standard? And actually, I have a kind of corollary for a different, more recent conversation that's been happening on the servers. People have been comparing Command and Conquer and other types of RTS games to each other. And I think that like Command and Conquer just ends up being different for the sake of it, not because they actually wanted to, or maybe they did think it could be a real improvement over the status quo, but there doesn't seem to have been a well thought out reason, and the results do not bear out that hypothesis, we'll say. So that's like another example is like, if you're just trying to be different for the sake of it, all you do is create this trivia where players have different expectations between maps or between games in the same genre, and users and developers have different expectations between different programs without really any justification. Like, there's nothing you gain by changing the name of a cooldown to period. Just like there's nothing you gain from changing a hotkey in Blender compared to the competitors of 3ds Max and so on. And just like you don't see any real gain beyond the vague experimentation. Like, I guess you'll know if it was a gain if it took off in theory, but beyond vague experimentation in an RTS genre, I don't see the gain of changing it so that, power plants and silos exist instead of whatever the fuck most normal RTS games had. So that's just another sort of
it's really
example.
Baffling. Like, with Blender, it's really baffling, because you would think that when you're making 3D software, you'd be like, okay, so Autodesk owns everything. Why do people use Max instead of Maya? Why do people use Maya instead of Max? Look at their interfaces. Figure out how people go through a learning process. Like, this is really like the first thing you would do when you're building this software is, I want to build an alternative. Obviously, I want to, make money off of it and be successful. I mean, it's free, but they get donations, they get advertisements. It's for profit. And, you would think about what ways would you want to do to be as successful and as competitive as possible, because, you want to have that success. And the easiest way to do that is to figure out why everybody else is successful and then disseminate that and then work out from there and how you can improve from that point. But it's like nobody ever even thought of that. It's like, well, I'll just shoot in the dark. And if it doesn't work, I'll just shoot in the dark a second time. And if that doesn't work, then I'll shoot in the dark a third time. And they just keep shooting themselves. And it's really grim and dark, and, it just isn't the answer. And it's really depressing to watch. And that's precisely what Blender does. Just shooting in the dark wildly with, buckshot, just screaming and hooting and hollering and just hoping for the best. And, well, never really quite finding anything besides their own foot. And as much as people who follow in Stallman's sacred progressive footsteps, enjoy stalls, you really just can't eat off of your own feet. It's not proper form. So stop doing it.
Yeah, exactly.
But they don't stop doing it. They don't. So what you have is Blender releases their newest version, which is 2.8, and nobody understands what the fuck is going on at all. And everybody just kind of shakes their head, and now you've invalidated all of the previous efforts that people made towards documenting your insanely confusing user interface by throwing another insanely confusing user interface and changing a whole bunch of conventions and stuff all over again, and now everybody suffers for no real immediate reason. Like, okay, if you're going to be different, be different. But do you have to be different every day of the week? Like, do you have to be different fluid? Like, just establish a fucking convention of some kind so you don't throw out years of people's documentation, including your own. Like, it's just baffling to be doing this stuff. It's like when fucking Blizzard and Relic make these huge sweeping changes across the board to all the balance in their game because, like, one or two things are kind of overpowered or underpowered. It's like if we were to walk into StarCraft 2 or StarCraft 1 rather, and throw a randomizer at all the fucking numbers because people don't build enough scouts. That's precisely what they're doing in StarCraft 2, and it is just so fucking dumb. This is why the game has no competitive scene. There is no sense of stability for anyone, competitive or otherwise. It's a fucking mess end to end, and you keep jumbling it up and making it more of a mess because you don't know what the fuck you're doing. And that's been one of the main reasons why Dawn of War is a garbage game, because the people who making it don't know what the fuck they're doing. Their response to the game being imbalanced was to throw fucking hard caps and hard counters on everything. Fucking great. And you know how they did this? In gigantic multi-page patches that changed the entire fucking game upside down. And then everybody stopped playing because it was garbage. And then you had their awful implementation of air units on top of it afterwards. It was pretty bad. And what do you know? That's precisely what Blizzard does in their games. StarCraft 1, considered one of the most balanced games ever created for the RTS genre, received very, very few patches. Why was it balanced? Because people figured out how to play it. StarCraft 2 has been universally considered one of the worst balanced games in existence. What do you know? Giant sweeping changes from the fucking get-go before we even entered release. They still had no idea what they were doing. The fucking history of the Infestor and the Raven alone should tell you this company has yet to hire anybody who's actually played the fucking game before. And, you'll probably see much the same with Warcraft 3 because they've started patching the balance for that game again. Not that Warcraft 3 ever established any kind of groundwork to work with. I mean, Night Elves. But,
you know, they got even more broken after the most recent patches. Or not most recent, but when they started doing these patches again, they made it like increase the entangling roots cast range or something psychotic.
Oh my God.
And then they had to decrease it, and they're reading their reasoning for their decreasing is exactly like reading Riot Games balancing, where they're just like,
their
patch notes
really bad.
Yeah, they list like, we think it's not fair for this character to have this range on this ability, and then if you go back like one patch ago, they're like, we think it's not fair that this character has such a short range on this ability. It's like the same fucking thing. That's basically what happened with the Keeper of the Grove, as far as I understand.
Riot has no idea how to balance the game at all. They are textbook bad. Like, I always go to the Dawn of War example because when Dawn of War 1 came out, and at the beginning of Winter Assault, it wasn't a great game, but it was an okay game. And then they turned it to shit in a real hurry. Within the span of like one patch, they shit all over everything by introducing so many fucking hard caps.
Don't you think it's kind of funny that
Riot's been bad since the beginning?
Yeah. I think it's kind of funny that we're finding so many parallels between like people making ridiculous changes to their software and or like starting out to make a competitor software and not doing it properly by looking at why people use the other competition and trying to one up their competition like through features. It's like the same fucking thing that games developers do. And then when they're actually balancing stuff, it's the same thing as like changing the interface or reworking the interface.
No.
It's very funny that it's like all the same, regardless of the nature of the software. Software is always shit.
Yep. It's because the developers are fucking morons.
Yeah.
It's always people who don't use their own software. It's always people who they're in control of it because, they're just lucky enough to be on top.
Hey, you'll like this,
brother
actually.
Was on top or something.
I got a good little anecdote here to share. So, you just said use your own software. That's pretty much like the biggest lesson I can give to anybody who's aspiring to be a developer, like a tool dev. And actually, like one of the reasons why I'm backing iQuare so heavily with the changes that he's making, he's actually making his own map editor, his own grafting tool to finally replace Firegraft, who's coded by a fucking mongoloid rapist. And then we have to deal with eventually we're going to usurp SCM draft because like the source is closed. He's busy taking pictures of cats or something. You can't actually help, which I get, cats are important, but come on, maybe update your code or at least release it to us. So I'm backing iQuare pretty heavily because he's doing it because he sees deficits in the existing tools. And he's like, well, if nobody's going to fix that, I am going to. So I'm like going to be learning programming later to try to help him. I'm sure I'll be more of a hindrance than anything, but we'll see what happens. The bottom line is he's doing this because he needs to use tools. He's like making tools that he needs so that he can make his content. And like that's exactly what you want. You don't ever want a person to just become a tool dev and not actually be using it for anything. It's like the exact opposite of what you would want. And I think that tool like programmers in general or game developers in general, or modders even, like they will have ideas and maybe their ideas won't be great, but they'll have some ideas of how to improve the software that they're working with because they're the ones using it all the time. And if you are a tool dev, but you actually want your tool to be a public facing utility that everybody uses and, for whatever reason or another, regardless if it's for profit, you should be asking these people, just like if you're making a tool like Blender from the ground up, if you're just starting to work on like a 3D modeler, you should be asking people who use Blender or who use 3ds Max, who use Maya, who use all this other stuff, why do they use these programs? What do they like about them? And see what you can learn, especially if you're not yourself a modeler, in which case I wonder why the fuck you're making the software to begin with. But the reason why I'm backing iQuare is because he's making it for himself and for other people like myself to use so that we can finally replace the stupid asinine tools that we were forced to use because there's literally nothing else. There's no competition. Sort of like Fraps before OBS got unfucked by your changes, your one line of code
I
change.
still don't think they've officially fixed that.
Yeah.
Which is insane.
The anecdote that I'm going to share will blow your mind. So I want you to strap in. Now, the Python MPQ editor, it was supposed to replace WinMPQ. Now, this is not going to blow your mind as much, but probably will still blow your mind. It is so fucked that if you try to open it, so you open an MPQ in PyMPQ that wasn't made using PyMPQ. It was made using WinMPQ or some other MPQ compiler. And you take a sound file, you select it, and you extract it. That will crash the program. And now hold on. That will crash the program. It'll make the archive, like it'll make the folder structure the way it normally does, but it won't export the sound. It'll just crash. Now, after that, keep in mind, that's not what was supposed to destroy you. What's going to destroy you is that in WinMPQ and in PyMPQ, there is an obscure option in the options menu, an obscure setting, I should say, that's the limit of files you can have in an MPQ archive. For both of these programs, it's defaulted to 1024. And where it says limit of MPQ file or limit of files available in an MPQ archive, it says cannot be edited for existing archives. Now in PyMPQ, if you go and change this in the options dialog and then close the program and restart, it does not change. And if you go into the code of the program and set it to anything you want, like 65535 or some other really large number, save that and then start the program, it still does not change. Now, it is possible to open an MPQ using LaTeX MPQ editor and hit 2 buttons and you've expanded the size of your MPQ. It is not possible to do this in PyMPQ. And if you try to then open that MPQ in PyMPQ, it opens fine, but every time you add a file, it clones the file instead of actually keeping it there. Now, in order to... this is what spawned this entire conversation topic, man, because in order for me to get... all I wanted to do was add like 1 sound file. I needed to add 1 sound file, and I was limited to 1024. This is not a limitation of the file archive, the file format, and it's not a limitation even in the time where StarCraft was released. Stardat.mpq has 3,000 files in it. So why is there a limit of 1,024 as the default option that cannot be changed in PyMPQ? And why can I open it in a different MPQ editor and expand it when it says you can expand existing archives? Why? Now, again,
well, I mean...
if this guy had ever decided to make a mod and actually just even to test whether or not his import function worked with large numbers of files and imported over 1,024 files at any point, he probably would have noticed that this was bugged and, fixed it maybe. But he didn't use his own tool. He never used his own tool. And this is why we have so many bugs, like it crashing when you export a fucking sound file that the program itself did not import. Or most recently, up until about like a month ago, if you use the delete key when trying to edit a file name, that would also crash the program. Oh, and scrolling in the tile editor crashed for a while. That was good. So yeah, Unreal sounds great, is what I'm saying. Please use your fucking tools. Please just scroll around. I mean, you make me sign into a Microsoft
like whenever
service.
I play a game and it's like nobody ever actually played this. Like God of War Ascension. Nobody has ever played that game before.
It's exactly the same.
They published a game that literally had not been played a single time. I mean, StarCraft II, Heart of the Swarm, same thing. A fucking roach burrowing where the fuck it was playing infinitely. Like, first playthrough, this is going on for half an hour. Like, come on.
I like how you must have tuned it out at some point because you just stopped commenting on it. And then, like, a half hour later after the transmission, you were like, wait, what? Injured roach? What? Why is this still here? It was really
yes, I will tune that stuff out, and then something else will happen, and I'll be like, oh, why is this?
Listen.
And the Infestor sounds or something, too, I think also broke.
Yeah, well, there's just a bug with the engine where it would randomly take a sound file that had played and then loop it for about 30 minutes. It was not really clear why it got fixed, like why it eventually stopped looping. But that's also like when Blizzard... the actual Blizzard spell in Warcraft 3 would just get stuck in the UI channel and you're in the middle of the fucking menu.
Oh, it did that for all the fucking sounds.
Yeah.
In my fucking run, it did that incessantly.
Yeah.
And that was a new bug. That's not an old bug. It's new.
Yeah. It was from their patches most recently. Apparently. It was happening in Grubby a lot when I kept watching.
Blithering, confounded idiots.
Yeah. So I guess the main takeaway here is use your fucking tools. And maybe give some suggestions to actual tool devs who will update to. Unfortunately, Poiquirt only exists to play Terraria or something. So he'll never update PyMPQ. Play that? It's like Minecraft with...
it's like Minecraft. Casual version of Dwarf Fortress. It's like they don't want to play Dwarf Fortress, so they play like some kind of really shitty-looking semi-clone of it.
Listen, eventually they're going to have to play my anime mods, so...
Oh, dear.
Since we're close to the tail end, and I say that because I'm pretty sure the food is ready, shall we close this out? Any final thoughts? Any closing remarks?
The Unreal stuff is definitely something that needs to be really like seen and experienced to really understand it, because it's not really something I can really explain in words very well, because I don't even really understand it that well. But like I said, like it's easy to forget that this stuff even exists because you haven't been working with real tools. I came out of StarCraft II and Sins of Solar Empire and stuff like that, where basically if you had problems, you're just fucked. And there was, of course, a million problems, not just the games themselves. Of course, those were problems. But there's a lot of problems. Now, then I got swung back into Blender. It turns out if you have two objects with the same name in the scene that can't export, it'll throw you a Python error of something extremely vague. And I spent, on two separate occasions, an entire day looking to try to figure out what this vague error was, because Google results would basically turn up. It could be anything. It literally could be anything. It was mostly people complaining about plugins or stuff like that. But it was actually, there was two things with the same name in the scene, and it couldn't export it for some reason. So once I changed the name of the objects, the error would mysteriously go away. And I would come out of that feeling so disgusted, so absolutely disgusted, not just because I'd wasted so much fucking time, but because this program is version 2.81 and people still haven't figured out how to do basic error reporting.
Yeah.
Like, it's fucking insane. And then at that point, you really take for granted just how valuable having actual error reporting and stuff like that actually is, or, you know, being a tool developer and being able to make your own error reporting and something like that. Once you have this stuff, you never want to leave it. And like with StarCraft 2, it's just, you forget like what it's actually like to work in a actual production environment with real actual tools that people have actually used before, because you become desensitized to the insane stupidity of the stuff that you're being force fed. And I think that's the only reason why there's any of these fucking apologists out there who still force themselves to use StarCraft 2 is because they've never actually tried to use a real tool set before, even like an actual like real game before, like just going from say StarCraft 2 to like, you know, say StarCraft 1, for example, StarCraft 1 or Diablo 2, like as many problems as stuff like these games have. There's so many more resources to actually get involved with them than there is in StarCraft 2. StarCraft 2, you've got nothing. And when you start trying to deal with stuff that actually takes some degree of effort to work with, like the fucking AI, you go in completely naked. You've got nothing. You've got absolutely fucking nothing. And yeah, I got a lot done not knowing absolutely fucking anything. But it took so many years more than it should have. And it, like, at the end of the day, you really should be asking yourself before you reach this point, like, is it worth the time? What am I getting out of it? Today, I would never recommend people to do mods when there's Unreal 4 out there. Like, not unless you're already so deeply set into it, like you guys are with StarCraft 1, where, you know, obviously at this point you can't really just throw out all that work. But for anybody
there's no
looking to actually
competition
get
for an
into this
actual
stuff,
RTS environment is the problem. I don't think it's possible to make a reasonable RTS in Unreal.
There is. You can. It exists.
Well, isn't it still pseudo 2D though for performance? Well, I mean for performance cases, like I don't imagine
it can handle it in performance. Listen, if this thing can handle the kind of shit that I've thrown at it, an RTS shouldn't have an issue. You might struggle a little bit with networking, but I think by the time you start worrying about networking, you're gonna have enough skills to deal with it.
Thinking.
Like there's no denying that it's gonna be a big learning curve, and that's gonna be a lot of work.
Of course.
But it is absolutely possible. I don't see any reason why it wouldn't be.
Might be something
like
I
the thing is that
if
you reach something that an existing solution doesn't exist for, you don't break wall, you modify the source code.
Well, we do have access
it's always
to source?
possible.
I thought you had to pay for that or something.
No. In UDK you did. Unreal 3 you did. Unreal 4 you have source for free. No license required.
Epic.
I build from source. I've already made source changes to it. I force-enabled CPU culling, for example, following HKS's instructions. And some other source changes we have also made are also in there. We've already done source changes to enable new features that don't normally exist. So, yeah, it's there. Like, if you know what you're doing, anything is possible. Yeah. The key part is knowing what you're doing. This stuff obviously does require, C++ or C or whatever, but I think it's almost all in C++. And if you don't know that, yeah, it's going to be really hard to implement custom systems for something that doesn't exist. But I don't see how performance would be an issue going across what I have seen. When people think about Unreal 4 and bad performance, it's largely because of Ark Survival or whatever it is. And that is a game using unprocessed third-party assets.
130
like
gigabyte install.
Yeah, they're using unprocessed assets from the kite demo and stuff like that, which are using 8K by 8K textures and models that do hundreds of thousands of triangles, for rocks and plants.
Yeah.
So
and they look like shit
that's
anyway
why it's
because
huge.
of their texture filtering settings.
And they are using this True Sky thing or something like that, this third-party Sky thing that you have to pay a monthly subscription fee for that is also really stupid and expensive and needless. They are doing all the wrong things. As much wrong as you can stuff into something. They have no sense of security whatsoever. Good luck at how they handle cheating and stuff in that game. There's a lot of stories about that. It's bad. But that was one of the first major Unreal 4 titles that came out. So it really painted an unfavorable image for the way that engine performs.
Well, I was mostly concerned about pathfinding in an environment where we're not using the A-star thing. We're using something else.
You can implement your own pathing systems. I have read about, when I did my research on pathing and Z and stuff like that, I came across a lot of solutions for people basically writing their own implementation of A-star.
Oh, okay.
But with major modifications that you can call from Blueprint in C++. So, there are definitely, ways around the pathing. I don't know enough about the pathing to tell you how well it's going to handle certain things or not, but I haven't seen anything thus far that would indicate that pathing is actually a issue for performance. I've seen lots of people making zombie shooters and uploading, basically, they were trying to problem solve other stuff. But they would have a video of their zombie shooter, and there would be 400, 500, 600 units on screen using generic soldier models, way higher poly, higher detail, higher bone count than you normally see in a game like Left 4 Dead. But there's 400, 500, 600 of these units running around. And pathing to the player and doing other stuff in a non-optimized environment that was probably built with Blueprint and not built in native code. So, worst case, all over the place. And, on their system, it performed. So, I definitely think it's quite doable. And, if performance becomes an issue later down the line, you have the tools to deal with that kind of stuff. So,
yeah.
It's something I've heard of before. Would an RTS work in it? I think that RTS is probably the hardest thing to make work in anything that isn't already an RTS.
Yeah.
And Unreal 4 isn't obviously built for an RTS right off the bat, but resources do exist to get into it. And I would recommend at least researching it. You don't have to work with the live 2D stuff and the paper 2D stuff if you don't want to. I can't attest to that kind of stuff if you want to work with sprites. I can tell you that right now, we do have other sprites and stuff working, and I can tell you that they perform extremely well, even on super low-end hardware. We're talking systems 10 years old, spawning, 500, 600 of these transparent images on top of each other and filling the screen with them and a whole bunch of other shit. There is extremely little performance loss. So I can tell you right now that just displaying sprites and stuff like that, not a problem at all in spite of overdraw and things like that. So that's not really too big of an issue. So
yeah, I wasn't sure if I was going to go. I don't know what kind of 2D shit they have. As far as I read, it was all emulated and not actual. But I don't know if there's a real distinction in this particular case.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know what you mean even by emulated. So
literally a 3D camera pointed in a 2D environment. Oh. It's not actually 2D is what I mean.
Well, technically, the orthographic camera I'm using to make my D&D maps, since it's orthographic, it is 2D. So
yeah, but it's still are you looking at 3D models, or do they somehow call the overdraw of what do they render everything in 3D, or are they rendering it in 2D based on your camera?
Well, this
position?
is rendered in 2D, but the thing is, to make a 2D image, you still have something that's ultimately 3D in this case.
Right. Yeah.
You probably can make a rendering system that's different than that. That's definitely beyond my knowledge scope.
Yeah, maybe it's not even necessary anyway. I was thinking a model-based, a 3D-based approach would probably be more useful for certain things, but usually the performance cost outweighs it. Because I think that back to
Age of Wonders 2. Age of Wonders 2, as far as I could tell, it has a 3D map, but everything on it is 2D, and that does cause some odd things. There's some projections on the ground that don't behave very well, but
They also have weird ass things in like Tiberian Sun, the second Command and Conquer game. They have voxels for the vehicles, and these things could like flip in the air, and they were essentially 3D things, but they were done in some strange format that allowed
voxels was supposed to be one of those next big things because it's supposed to be a lot more flexible for a lot of stuff like, say, destructive environments.
Right, yeah. But, which is what I would be going for, but it didn't end up being useful, it doesn't seem like.
Yeah, it's I've only ever seen voxels used in a tech demo, and that's because I think it's their performance. They just don't end up being
not for every unit anyway. There's a reason they were only for vehicles in that game, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah. So it's
well, you've told me on the idea of exploring it anyway, is what I'm trying to get at here. Is I'll definitely
at the very least, I think you should look into it, and because if you still are going to be working with Brood War, you might be able to understand some of the concepts behind why Brood War does stuff the way it does. You might be able to apply things you learn from it. Like I learned a lot about like just through working with blueprints and stuff like that. I've learned a lot about how the structure behind the way games do certain stuff with relations to like their animations and the asynchronicity of how some information is handled and stuff like that. So, and I haven't spent that much time with that at all. So I think it's definitely worth looking into, but I do think that this is probably like the most complicated thing to get into.
I was actually thinking of maybe making some sort of very basic team shooter environment thing. Like it's kind of psychotic to say.
That'd probably be really easy.
But for the fraud nights that we're doing, where I'm streaming some games or whatever, we're stuck with Counter-Strike and Brood War for now, and it would be nice to have a decent shooter that was actually performant and didn't look like it came out of fucking 2001, and was moddable as well, and I could actually customize things in it. And for that, I think we would probably just be like I'd have to make my own fucking game for Fraud Night basically. So I might end up doing something like that.
I think that if you really put a lot of time to it, I think you could have a functional shooter with multiplayer compatibility in a week.
Right.
Things like obviously like making the maps and stuff like that, depending where you get your assets from, or if you're trying to make your assets or what. Obviously that takes longer, but you know, when I set my mind to it and I wanted to make my player character dealing damage and stuff with the AI, I was using something a lot more complicated. Like there's 1,001 different things you can use. The example for shooters, you can just base it off the shooter demo that comes with the game, and that gives you, I think, everything, including multiplayer. Networking is more complicated. Like that's obviously the most complicated part of it at this stage. So, but getting into that is definitely a very educational experience. HKS has taught me a lot about that, since obviously he's doing the networking for our D&D client. But and I don't work on networking because mine's single player.
Right.
But it's not really that complicated. So, and I already know that the game performs really well on super low end hardware because I've tested it. There's at the very least, if you don't want to go through the effort of making like an options menu, there are console commands for changing graphics settings that anybody can use. So, you know, if somebody does have poor performance, there's a lot of different scalability options you can change from there that would help you net back performance from whatever your defaults are. So,
well, I think it would be a useful experience anyway. It's like you were saying, you could then take the information you gain from this and apply it back to something like Brood War with just at least a core understanding on a more like programmatical standpoint or something, and try to add some color and maybe get less frustrated as a result when certain things don't seem as obvious or as clairvoyant. So
it
I
also
think
help you get a bigger appreciation for how bad developers like Blizzard really are.
Yeah.
Like once you understand how simple a lot of this stuff is, it just becomes absurd that people get paid for being as incompetent as Blizzard is.
Well, I think that'll also help color my understanding of shit like Half-Life as well, because
Half-Life is really bad. The first story you open, there's so much fucking Z fighting. It's so crazy.
Yeah.
And the NPCs that just kind of like spin around and play us and walk around the predetermined waypoints when there's so much more you could do.
On my playthrough of that fucking NPC guy that you got caught on in your playthrough, I saw like your first segment. On my playthrough, that guy, he brick walled pretty quickly. I just kept standing in front of him, and then he started spinning, and like I didn't even have to do anything at that point. So that was just crazy. But yeah, so like obviously that's like older game anyway, but I think it would help me to like color my commentary when it comes to game like analysis and criticism, but also when it comes to like actually developing anything. And I figure a team-based shooter of some kind would actually be something that people would be interested in playing on the server, which would help me get playtesting done, and it's something that I already have enough experience, and I might as well just give it a crack. So that might be something that I explore later on. Probably not February, but March is when I'm going to be starting to work on programming some more anyway, so that'll be a good excuse to like try my hand at that.
Yeah.
So for sure. But yeah, I mean, it's sort of the same thing as like you want to be able to understand tools better. Is maybe the same thing will happen to me, and I won't want to go back to Brood War after learning what you can actually do with debugging and real tools and stuff. But we'll see how it is. I'm expecting the learning curve to be, pretty decent, and that requiring me to put in a fair bit of time just to understand stuff. So we'll see what happens. Yeah. But yeah, I don't know if you have any other thoughts on the whole topic. I think that when it comes to this trivia versus wisdom stuff, ultimately, like, one of the things that I wanted to get at was the idea that when you're designing a tool or you're designing any software, be it an actual game or a level in a game or tools to make a game, you should be attempting to make it as, like, I say basic as possible, but like intuitive as possible. Like, make it such that players and developers and users don't need to understand a lot of tool specific things with how things are. Like, understanding a file format is different. Understanding, hotkeys, I can even sort of give a pass in some senses, even though it really shouldn't be that much different than other similar tools or other equivalent tools. But being able to understand like how to get past the learning curve of something so that you can start expressing your skill as a developer, so that you can start improving and refining your skills as a developer, and so that you can start getting to the point where you're actually making content and producing content instead of just learning how to do those things. The quicker you can get to the point where you're making content, regardless of the quality of that content, generally the more intuitive your tool actually is. And if you have to think about like all the different things you have to get through in StarCraft 2, all the different menus you have to go through, just to place like a fucking start location, just to start painting terrain, just to start making a custom unit, like, forget about it. You're going to be stuck there. Like, imagine actually understanding the data editor in any competent way. Requires you to basically like study the whole thing for a week just to make a single functioning unit that isn't just a literal carbon copy of another unit. So like that's just insane to me. It's like, really, this should be as simple as just pushing new unit button and then defining some things.
It brings me back to when StarCraft 2 came out and people said the editor has to be hard to use because it's complicated.
Yeah.
As if complication ever has any bearing on something actually being difficult to get into or not.
It's just tism.
Because this stuff I'm working with is more complicated than anything you could ever even hope to do in StarCraft 2, and it is so easy to work with because it all comes down to the presentation of the information.
So, present your information well, and stop making puzzle maps, Necron, you fucking idiot. Stop crashing when I export a sound file, you fucking moron. I think
he's too busy huffing Jenka and Crazy Mountain. Crazy and spoiled eggs or whatever it is they feast on over there.
I don't know. I think he was feeding a snail. Oh, holy shit, my whole computer died. I think he was feeding a snail eggs at some point, so that was psychotic. This strange man.
I guess a snail is kind of like a less